Welcome. Welcome to Mainline Unitarian Church for our Buddhism discussion panel. We have three guests with us today who will be introduced to you momentarily, but I wanted to explain our format for this afternoon briefly. Nuala Carpenter, who's a member of our congregation, is going to introduce our guests and tell you a little about our meditation program here at MLUC. Each guest will have a relatively brief period of time to tell you something about themselves, about their experiences with Buddhism and how Buddhism impacts our world. And then we'll have time for those of you who are here in the audience to ask questions. We do have microphones, so when it's time for you to ask your question, just indicate to me that you need a microphone and I'll come around and make sure that you have one. We do ask people to use the microphone because we are recording. We have members who are out of town who would have liked to have been here who specifically asked us to do that. So in addition to accommodating those with hearing loss, it's a good thing for the recording for all the questions to actually be audible. So thank you for being here. Thank you for being here. And Nuala, I will pass it on to you.
Welcome to all of you. As you all know, we draw on wisdom of a variety of wisdom traditions. And this led me to study Buddhism 30 years ago now, which are hard to believe. And I will say the teachings have changed my life. And that is why I'm particularly pleased to welcome these three Buddhist teachers here this morning. We have an active meditation community here, drawn from many traditions, and is open to all, experienced practitioners and beginners alike. We have two meeting times on Sunday morning, one at 8:30 and the other at 11:30, so you can go to meditation and participate in worship. We also have a study group which meets early Monday mornings. We also run other programs. The next one we have is on mindful parenting, and this is suitable for parents, teachers, grandparents, and it's going to be on Saturday, November the 16th. There is more information on our website, which is mluc.org, and a chance to register. We have a meditation steering committee which plans these events. There are a few of you here. If anybody who's on the committee, please stand so people will know who you are. Yeah, Katrina, Sue, Jean, and Terry, and myself. So if anyone has any questions about meditation here, we'd be very happy to answer them. Let me just bring up my information here. So we have three panelists here today. Tony Boris is a senior teaching student and a former president of Chenzing Tibetan Buddhist Center of Philadelphia. Tony teaches and leads a variety of groups. He is co-founder of the animal welfare nonprofit Philadoptables, and he maintains a Buddhist blog. A lifelong seeker, he's followed and found deep meaning in the world's great spiritual traditions. He lives in the Mount Airy section of Philadelphia with his wife Darlene and their dog Zelda. Walt Lyons has been practicing Buddhism and a Buddhist meditator for more than 30 years. He began his practice as a member of the Philadelphia Buddhist Association in the 1980s. He then became a non-resident Zen student at Mountain Monastery, took the Bodhisattva precepts, and became a Buddhist. He became a student at Soji Zen Center and has had many different roles there. And he's recognized as a Dharma holder, an elder, or assistant teacher. He co-founded and teaches at the Buddhist Meditation Group, which meets in Medford, New Jersey. Grace Song is an ordained Won Buddhist. She is the chair of the Won Buddhist Studies Department at the Won Institute of Graduate Studies. She's also the Buddhist chaplain at the University of Pennsylvania. She spent years in Korea training under several Won Buddhist teachers. Grace currently teaches classes at the Won Institute and also runs retreats in the US and Korea. She is passionate about bringing mindfulness into school settings and co-organizes annual mindfulness workshops for educators. She loves Philadelphia, but Toronto will always be our hometown. So you're all very welcome here.
Thank you.
I'm not sure who's starting.
Oh, I think by virtue of last name, I am. I always got lunch first when I was in elementary school. So I guess I get to talk first also. Dispatch with the phone. I don't, what do you prefer? Do you two want to sit at the table, or do you want to? This okay?
Either one's okay for me.
All right. The group conscience has spoken. We shall sit at the table. So my name is Tony, and I want to thank Dawn for this amazing invitation, and everyone here at the church who's helped participate in making this possible. And in the spirit of interdependence, from a Buddhist perspective, that would be everybody at the church, because everybody is a participant here and equal. So I would like to thank everybody, including all of you sitting here today, for having us and having this conversation. And I'd also like to thank my panelist friends, because we've never met, but I'm so thrilled to hear what they have to say. I can't wait. So in the short amount of time that we have, I will tell you just a little bit about, I'm not sure what I'll tell you, because I have 6 pages of notes, and I'm sure I'm not going to get to all of them. My center is the Chenrezig Tibetan Buddhist Center in Philadelphia. And so our particular tradition in this world of Buddhism is the Tibetan tradition. And probably our most famous emissary is His Holiness the Dalai Lama, which I was taught not to make assumptions, but I'm nonetheless going to assume that probably most of you here are familiar with His Holiness. My teacher at the center is Losang Santen, and he was His Holiness's attendant for a number of years until a group of people in Philadelphia, he was actually invited to make the first sand mandala outside of Tibet, and that was in New York. And so he started to teach in New York and then came to Philadelphia and made a mandala at the Natural History Museum and gained some students who then created a petition to ask His Holiness's permission, not that it's permission needed, but to implore His Holiness to allow Losang to stay in the U.S. and teach. And his advice to Losang was, I just don't want to see you opening a Tibetan restaurant. That's okay. You can do it. I think that our tradition, we're a little bit the Episcopalians of Buddhism. We do a lot of, while we do a lot of sitting meditation, we also do a lot of recitation and prayers. And you may, if you're familiar with anything about us, we have a lot of wall hangings and thangkas and statues and things like that. So in our practice of Buddhism, just from a practical standpoint, we use these things to embody the Buddhist teachings of wisdom, and we'll say wisdom and compassion. I think at the heart, in reflecting on, what Shakyamuni Buddha has come to do, is my reflection is that through his deep and profound practices, he was able to really sort of get to the heart of the nature of self, the nature of reality, and if you want to call it meaning of life, really reach the state of no more learning, of recognition of things as they are, and offered the tools back to us to engage in those practices. When I was 17, I hitchhiked to California. I thought the story that I would quickly tell is in my hitchhiking to California in my junior year of high school, By the time I got to California from Philadelphia, I had a stack like this of the book called Good News for Modern Man. And if you're familiar with it, I guess it's the New Testament, is that right? And my reflection on that was the idea that humans are flawed, that we are inherently flawed, and that it requires sort of an outside source to some. We need new parts, but that we ourselves are inherently flawed. I think that the Buddha's teaching was that, in fact, the remarkable news is that the nature of who we are as individuals, as humans, is at its essence kindness and compassion and love and all of the things that Reverend Jones just so beautifully spoke of in the last hour. And that by engaging in the practices that we engage in, by practicing kindness, by practicing compassion, we are becoming better people, but we are actually coming closer and apprehending the nature of who we actually are. Perhaps one of the unique features of Buddhism, and it's not unique to what the three of us practice, but we in Tibet, the Tibetan tradition maybe does it a little different, is that there's kind of this idea of what we call the two wings of the dove, the two distinct types of practices that we do. And one would be this sort of compassion practice of love and kindness. And then the other would be sort of a more analytical practice, what we refer to as a wisdom practice, or you may have heard the term emptiness. And it is not that, if you're familiar with the term emptiness, it's not nihilism. It's not the idea that nothing exists, which sometimes I think is superimposed on our philosophy. But the apprehension from a deep level of our interdependency, our deep connection to each other, such that the way that we think about ourselves as individuals is actually a little bit dreamlike. We have this notion that I stop and you begin. But when we engage in the practices that we do, we recognize that the distinctions between one person and another, the distinction between the seed and the tree or the rain and the grass, they start to become more and more indistinct when we do these practices deeply. And so in doing that analytical kind of practice, our heart opens up much more deeply to compassion. Compassion being the wish that no being should suffer, right? Not simply sympathy or caring or concern that another being suffers, but the recognition that we wish from the bottom of our hearts that no being anywhere should suffer. So that the more deeply we practice compassion and love, the more deeply we understand the interdependence of all things and of all beings. And the more deeply we understand this notion of interdependence, the more our hearts open up to compassion and love and kindness, and they really serve each other. So I don't want to take too much time. So what I'll just do, I think, and then I'll turn it over to whose last name goes next after B, is read one of the short practices from our prayer book, which we read every at our services. So we call these the 4 immeasurable thoughts. May all beings have happiness and the causes of happiness. May all beings be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. May all beings never be separated from the happiness that knows no suffering. May all beings live in equanimity, equality, and free from attachment and aversion. And if I had to say what Tibetan Buddhism is about, I would say those 4 verses cover it pretty well. So I thank you so much for your time here today. Thank you.
Okay.
Last name.
I'm next. Okay. So thank you again for inviting us. It's a real honor to be here, although it was not easy getting here.
So taking a lift.
Anyhow, so I'm a senior student at the Soji Zen Center in Lansdowne, Pennsylvania. Our teacher is Shuzen Sensei, and we're from a traditional Zen lineage. I'm not going to say too much more about Soji. I did bring along some flyers. If anybody would like to visit, we'd very much like to have you there. What I was going to focus on is my understanding of some very basic ideas about Buddhism. And people tend to think that Buddhism can be very complicated, and we can make it very, very complicated. We could fill this room with books on Buddhism, sutras and commentaries on sutras and opinions and scholarly works and on and on and on. That's not necessary. This can be stated very simply and very easily. And I'm going to talk about something I saw on Facebook. Now, okay. The basic teaching of the Buddha is called the Four Noble Truths. And those are, at least in the version that I like, right understanding of suffering, of its origin, of its cessation, of the way leading to the cessation of suffering. Now, in one of the versions of so those Four Noble Truths are part of the Noble Eightfold Path. So it's already getting a little complicated, right? And that is composed of several factors: right intentions, which has 3 subsections; right speech, 4 subsections; right action, 3 subsections; right livelihood, that only has 1; right effort is 4 subsections; right mindfulness, 4 subsections; right concentration, again, only 1. So that is the most basic and the most simple of all the Buddha's teachings, but already we seem to have complexity. So I mentioned Facebook. So I was looking on Facebook and I saw something from the Tall Grass Zen Center, and it was titled Buddha's 4 Noble Truths for a 4-year-old. And here's how it goes. The first noble truth: sometimes people feel sad. The second: sometimes the thing that makes people sad is not getting something they want or getting something they don't want. The third noble truth: there is a way not to be so sad about not getting what you want or getting something you don't want. 4, and this is the way to the cessation of suffering. The way is not to think so much about what you want at all, but instead think about how you can be kind and helpful to your family, your teachers, your friends, other people, animals, bugs, and everything that lives. Now, have we got that? Any problems with that? Is that clear enough? You know, just to talk a little bit, I want to try and relate it a little bit to other parts of the teaching, but not to make it too complicated. You know, the classic definition of the first noble truth is right understanding of suffering. Suffering is usually defined as anxiety, unease, unhappiness, distress, misery, frustration, on and on and on. 4-year-old says, sometimes people feel sad. That's suffering. Where does the suffering come from? So we could think, well, suffering comes from bad things that happen to us. And that means we are thinking that something outside of us causes suffering. But let's just stop for a minute and consider an example. Suppose you have, pardon me. You have a job. Sure. You have a job that you have to work very long hours, and you really, and you have to work 7 days a week, 12 hours a day. You get one week off in the summer. Spring has been very dry, so you think, oh, I'll have a great week off in the summer. So that week comes, rains just like today, all week. You think to yourself, you're very unhappy. Oh, this is my only good week, and it's ruined. Down the road, there's a farmer whose crops are dying because the spring has been very dry. There's a drought. The farmer sees the same rain. He says, wonderful. Oh, my crops are saved. I love this. Oh, he's very happy. So you have two people, same place, same time, same event. What's the difference? Each person is looking at it from the point of view of what they want, the way things should be. Well, the rain is just the rain. The sun is just the sun. Things are as they are. Our likes and dislikes, our craving, our grasping, that's the problem, not the rain, not the sun. The problem is not out there. The problem is in here. So we need to take a look at the 4-year-old's version again. Sometimes the thing that makes people sad is not getting something they want or getting something they don't want. That's better than what I said. So once again, we talked about there is a way not to be so sad about getting what you want or getting something you don't want. And so we could get very complicated about that. We could get into all those sutras and all those books and all of those very detailed practices that are very good, but which are just sometimes hard to really understand. But I'll go back to the 4-year-old's method and say, again, the way to end our suffering is not to think so much about what you want at all, but instead think about how you can be kind and helpful to your family, your teachers, your friends, other people, animals, bugs, and everything else that lives. So maybe if we keep in mind the 4-year-old's method of understanding Buddhism, we might be a little better off in understanding what it's all about. And I'm going to end with a poem from a Zen koan. It's not totally relevant, but I like it, so I'm going to read it anyway. So this is a verse by Muman from the koan, Nansen's Ordinary Mind is the Way, case 19 of the Muman koan. The spring flowers, the autumn moon, summer breezes, winter snow. If useless things do not clutter your mind, you have the best days of your life. Thank you.
Thank you again for the invitation. It's wonderful to be here. I'm going to just start with a personal story because people always ask, they say, Grace, how did you become a minister? And I was born into a one Buddhist household. It's one Buddhism, W-O-N. And I was blessed to have parents who every year would save money so they could take myself and my sister to Korea to meet my father's teacher. So at that time, I wasn't very familiar with the Korean language, so I didn't understand everything that was going on. So I would just observe. That was my role, just observe how the teachers live their life. And it was interesting because it was that time that I witnessed through a child's eyes that there is such a thing as a living Buddha. And so I think if you ask me, how did you learn about Walt Buddhism? It was through looking at how teachers live their life. And it was also through stories that my father would tell me, his stories about his interactions with his teacher. So I think those visits to Korea planted the seeds for me to eventually become a minister. But it was not until 2000, that was when my father, he was diagnosed with cancer. And it was the first time that I had to face dying and death, and I really didn't know what that was all about. In fact, I thought, my parents will live forever, had that assumption. And so it was very scary to me. And so that's when I started looking more deeply into Won Buddhism as an adult, to really look at what this dying process was all about. And it was through Won Buddhism, we have a ritual when a person passes away. It was after my father passed that we did this ritual, and through that 49-day deliverance service, I found some kind of healing. And so at that moment, I decided I would like to walk the spiritual path. And so people will ask, well, why Won Buddhism? Well, definitely it's because I was born into that household. But Won Buddhism, it's a fairly new tradition. It's only 104 years old, started in Southwest Korea in a very rural village. And the founding motto of the tradition is, with this great opening of matter, let there be a great opening of spirit. Meaning, we live in this world. How many of you, this is the question I usually ask students, how many of you do not have a smartphone? Okay. So when I ask this to high school students, they're all like, so we're living in a world, rapid changes are happening. It's becoming a digital savvy society. And so the founder of Won Buddhism said, we are creating a Buddhism that's not up in the mountains. If you know Korean history, much of our Buddhist history was monks living in a monastic setting up in the mountains, separate from the rest of society. But with this tradition, in Won Buddhism, they said, no, we're bringing the teachings to society. We're not separating the practice from the work. And so when we say, with this great opening of matter, let there be a great opening of spirit, it's saying, while you live in the society of rapid changes, how are we going to balance that with a strong spiritual practice? So the whole point of Won Buddhist practice is that meditation is practiced everywhere at every moment. And this is in other Buddhist traditions as well, whether you're talking, whether you're walking, whether you're washing the dishes, driving. You may have heard this before, just being fully present in what it is that you're doing. That is your meditation. And so in Won Buddhism, if you ask, what's the essence of your practice? It's about training the mind. Training the mind, because the mind is fundamental to everything that we do. Because moment to moment, we are making choices. The moment that you wake up, that was a choice. Eating breakfast, coming here, which is a very good choice. But what's behind all that? It's the mind. And if you've ever tried any kind of silent meditation, you may have noticed that the mind wanders. They use the example, they say the mind is like the wild ox, it's like the drunken elephant, the wild monkey. And so the whole point of meditation is to really train the mind so that whenever it is wandering off, you bring it back. And when we train the mind, not only do you renew yourself, you start renewing your family, your community, and the world. So one of the reasons why I have this deep faith in Won Buddhism is because I saw a living example of how the teaching works, and that's my father. My father, as a Won Buddhist, changed through the training. It actually saved our family. That's the way I look at it right now. He's not here today, But I say it changed because he knew, and he even told this to my mother. He said, do not stop me from practicing this if you want to save our family. That's what he said. Because he knew he had certain habits, ingrained habits that he needed to change. And he said, it's only through this training that I can change. So through years of dedication and commitment to the practice, he changed, which affected our family. And then I believe that when the family changes, you change the community. And then when the community changes, it naturally affects the world. So I saw that through the practice, if one person can change, it's very powerful. And so that's one of the reasons why I've decided to do the spiritual path, not only to cultivate well-being for myself, but for me to be able to help others. And so one of the beauties of Buddhism is that it has extended to various settings. So it's not just for Buddhists, it's for anyone who wants to train their mind. As Tony had said, to cultivate these two wings of compassion and wisdom. So I just feel very lucky to be able to share this space with you here today, because that's also another very important facet of Won Buddhism, which is interfaith dialogue, to be in the presence of other traditions. And it's a true testament that we can celebrate diversity while recognizing the common thread that connects us all. So thank you very much.
If you have a question you would like to ask, if you will indicate that you need the microphone, we will bring you a microphone.
One of the things that has always impressed me about Buddhism is its appreciation for all life. Recognize that all life is tied together. And the seventh principle of the Unitarianism is respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. So I think that we owe that to Buddhism. Thank you very much for bringing that to us. But I think we also should broaden the concept of the web of existence to include plants, bodies of water, the land, the whole universe we live in. Because as we observe that if you don't respect the land, bad things happen, starvation, and that we need to realize that we have to take care of everything, not just bugs and people, but we have to take care of our trees, our land, our water, all existence. And you're nodding, shows you already answered my question, that Buddhism also acknowledges that larger web of not just bugs.
Can I just respond to the question? So I'm so happy that you mentioned that. I recently did a meditation with high school students in Bucks County, and it seemed like a very simple meditation, but it was actually very powerful because it gave them an experience of what it means to live in this web of interconnectedness. And it was an orange meditation. And so they sat with the orange in front of them and asked them to close their eyes, and they held the orange, and they started to imagine the orange as a seed. And then we slowly went through the process of the seed. What went into the seed? The soil, the rain, all of that. Then it started to grow, and then it comes on the tree, and then the farmers have to pick the orange. The farmers have their parents. The farmers are wearing clothes made by other people, and we started just to see that one orange, to have that one orange come to them, it required so many causes and conditions that we may not be able to see with our eyes. And so we said to ourselves, imagine ourselves as humans, how much goes into our, creation, and then we call that the graces that exist.
Well, I second that emotion. Similarly, and I think this extends to all of our traditions, the notion of we're now into the world of causes and conditions, which can seem a little complicated at times. We have a similar practice which would be to simply take all of the things that you have right now, or maybe the car that you came in here on, however you got here, the clothes that you wear, and imagine all the beings and all the natural processes that were responsible for what we're wearing right now. And if you actually sort of run through that list, it becomes immeasurable and it becomes without beginning and it becomes without end. Because of course, the person who created the factory that built the clothes, their parents, their parents, their parents, their parents. And we realize this sort of world of appearances that we live in where, oh, well, this is my shirt. It is so conditioned upon innumerable other conditions and other beings for whom we owe gratitude for our existence, that in a sense to equal the field is to give that gratitude back, give our service back to the very people who are responsible for all the things that we have. We don't, and I think this was part of Reverend Jones's what you said earlier, that we're not sort of sole actors. Everything that we enjoy is absolutely due to the kindness of other beings and these natural processes and kindness to the environment. Yeah. So same.
Just to add to that, one of the fundamental teachings of Buddhism is that we suffer because of our greed, our aversion, and our ignorance. But there's something much more beyond that, something so subtle that we don't even know it's happening. The real problem is our separation from the rest of the universe. In Zen terms, we tend to think of ourselves as a bag of skin. And everything that's inside that bag of skin is me, and everything that's outside is not me. And that is the fundamental error, because there is no separation between me and the rest of the universe. I am the rest of the universe. Everything I do has a consequence to the universe. Everything everything the universe does has a consequence to me. And actually, there are no consequences back and forth because there's no separation. The Buddha's most difficult teaching it's sometimes referred to as not self, but I think it would be better expressed as no separation. That we are not separate. If we get that, we've got it.
Thanks for the question.
In all of the readings that I've done, I always come across the concepts of no self and emptiness. Could each of you explain your concept version of no self and emptiness in 25 words or less, please? Thank you.
You want to go in reverse order on that one, guys? You want to pick up from what you were just saying? Yeah.
Yeah, it kind of ties into what I was saying. So we're talking about no self and emptiness. See, emptiness is kind of the idea that all things in the universe are empty of our ideas about them, okay? So I can go out for a walk out here, and I can see something on the ground. I call it a stone, and I pick it up, and I drop it, and it hits my foot. It's wet. It's real, because it hurts when it hits my foot. But everything else about it is an illusion in terms of, see, I might pick this up and I say it's a green rock. Oh, I like green. You might come along and say, I hate green. I might like rocks because I used to collect them. Somebody else, when they were a child, people threw stones at them. They hate rocks. See, all of this stuff that we think about the world is conditioned by our past experience. The reality is everything is empty of what our ideas are. Our ideas are just our ideas. Your ideas are different from mine. So the rock is empty of my ideas and yours the cup. And most importantly, we are empty of the ideas we have about ourselves. I'm a good person, I'm a bad person, I'm a winner, I'm a loser. All illusion. Let it go.
So how do you teach this to a 4-year-old? That's a question. So we try to teach this in our mindfulness and education to students. Like, what does it mean to not have, thank you for bringing that, the labels that we have about ourselves. And each of us, if you are in a certain situations, these labels can come up for us. I'm bad at math. I'm a bad public speaker. Or I'm a good dancer. This is also a label. And there is, in the Chinese characters, we say pibi or pibi, which means not, but not either. It's a negation, saying it's not, but not either. So how do we teach this to children? We say the moment that label comes up for you, you say not. I can be good at math. I may not be good at math. I'm neither this or that. If I study hard, I could do well on that math test. If I don't, then I may fail. So there's not this nor that. So what you're left with is this non-label of limitless potential. And this has been liberating for many students. Another way you can see it, no self, especially in the one Buddhist tradition, is we say public spirit. The moment that you realize that there is no separate self, you become one with all, and you have the spirit of the compassion to help other people. So in our tradition, that's a very important term. It's no self is important, but also this idea of a public mind, which also motivates oneself to be of service to the world.
And I'll pick it up from there, and I want to answer your question in sort of 2 different ways. To reflect what Grace is saying, the mindfulness, sort of, I guess if you want to call it a movement, the idea of mindfulness, of being present to the moment. One of the things that comes out of that is the idea, as Grace, you're expressing, non-judgmental awareness of something as it is without labeling it one way or another. And we all recognize that some things are easier to see, they're changing than others. So that when we attach a label to something, we're often surprised to find that if it's a person, that person turns out not to be the way that we thought that they were. And then we're left with having to make an amends to them for sort of saying something about them that was not true. And so I think one of the virtues of the idea of emptiness is the idea of being with another as they are in that moment, and not with no particular impression or assumption about who they are, and not a projection onto them with any kind of judgment at all. And Grace talking about the people that are most influential or compelling to us are the people who, when we are with them, they are with us in this moment. And you feel that you are with that person, and all of a sudden there is relationship, the sort of I am thou idea. So I think this is the virtue that arises from the notion of emptiness that is spoken about. The words no self and emptiness are problematic. The best way that I know how to kind of describe it is that I think in our daily lives we recognize that we change, but we see things sort of like a cinema reel. So we are this way, this frame, we're this way, the next frame, we're that way. We are a series of existences that somehow magically change when we move the frame quickly enough. What the notion of, what I would say is maybe a more easily understood concept that we use is shunyata, which is the notion of interdependence. So that when we analyze ourselves, right, we recognize that every idea, every thought, every neuron that's firing in our brains is changing us at a speed that is incalculable to us. So in fact, while we say, oh my gosh, Grace, you've changed, over 20 years, the change is happening at a rate that is actually, we couldn't possibly grasp if we tried to grasp it. So the nature of things is not, it exists, then it exists, then it exists, then it exists. But in fact, if you try to find something as it exists, you will find that you cannot do that. You cannot define the thing because it's always different, it's always in flux, it's always in the process of change. And so in the idea of mindfulness, that again is the moment that we can be with another person in that sort of changing eternal moment. And I think that's the virtue of the Buddhist teaching from sort of a societal view, is that ability to be present to each other. But I think underlying it is that notion of you can't actually identify the thing if you try.
Okay, I have a comment or a question. My knowledge of Buddhism is extremely limited. My first exposure to it was when we were in Thailand. We went to a monastery there. We spent a day talking to the various monks, the students, and I really enjoyed being there. I got a really good feeling about it. But now listening to you three people, it's almost like you're vanilla, you're chocolate, and you're strawberry. There seems to be many, I don't know, what can I say, sects or whatever involved with Buddhism, in that you can have, like yours seem to be about the closest to what I saw in Thailand, in that, what you were saying. Yours I enjoyed with the skin analogy. That kind of brought it into focus. Tony, you have just confused the heck out of me. I haven't quite. Yours seemed very esoteric and kind of a lot of little pieces, whereas the other two seem to have a direct focus on one main aspect, and I'm having a hard time understanding. I did read a book about it, and what I read in the book was similar to what I saw in Thailand. So I really felt that was Buddhism, but now a lot of flavors.
I think that's the beauty of Buddhism too. Yeah, we have various flavors. It started in India, went to Southeast Asia. It's traveled to so many different countries, and even Buddhism in America is different. You have traditions that from different countries, you come here, they've acculturated to, make it accessible to the audience. So definitely, I think it's actually normal that we're going to have different views, and we're going to have some common views as well. Or it's a common view expressed differently. And especially I felt that I'm a part of a Buddhist teachers gathering called the Gen X Buddhist Teachers Gathering. And it's wonderful because, seriously, we are from so many different types of traditions. And we learn so much from each other. So even being here today, I'm learning so much from Walt and Tony, their perspective. And so I think, yes, you're absolutely right. It's going to be sounding different. But I think that's part of the learning process for us as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think, I was reading Wikipedia last night on what the Buddha taught, so I could refresh. And I think that we all really come back to what Walt was talking about with the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. And so I don't remember the number, there's some number that Buddha gave 128,000 teachings or something like that, because the nature of what people are able to understand, where they are in a different place in a given time, is all different. So the teaching itself, the essence of what it is always the same. However, everyone sort of understands information differently, and that's why there are so many different strands of it, I would say. Yeah.
If I could just add, in Christianity, you have religions where everything is very formal and everybody's very dour and very serious and a lot of ritual. Then you have people who roll on the floor and handle snakes. Buddhism is just like that.
Which one of us are the ones rolling the snakes? That's
My first exposure to Buddhism was in the early 1950s through Thomas Merton, who was mentioned this morning by our pastor. And Thomas Merton had formed a relationship in conjunction with Suzuki, who was another wonderful teacher of mine. And what Merton did was marry the thought process of the Buddha with Christianity and allow it to become a transcendent thought process where you would do exactly what you've indicated today and then move yourself above that into a different relationship of a creator as you would understand it. And it's something that has changed my life, and I think what's happening here in our country with certain new legitimate preachers like Richard Rohr, who's a Franciscan priest who has adopted Buddhism and not so much the Buddhism as such, but using the methods of Buddhism to reach his conclusions into a spiritual realm that Western religion never, always ignored. So, I mean, I have found personally that the teachings of the Buddha are marvelous. And this ability to transcend into a certain area and cleanse the mind, and then move on to another station where it becomes a whole different reality of living has been a wonderful, wonderful thing. And I'm hoping that it becomes more and more prominent in our country because, you know, as this gentleman said, you know, the Christianity of the rolling of snakes and everything like that, it's something far different from that, with the new understanding of Eastern thought married with Western belief systems.
Yeah. You know, I just want to reflect on that just real quickly. You know, I think that when I think about Buddhism, and I think what people think about Buddhism, and I think that they go, oh, well, it's really nice to know that there are people out there who are sort of practicing peace and who are kind of kind and gentle and all and so forth. And that's a really important thing to have in the world. And there are layers and layers and layers. So if that's what, like my barber, I got my hair cut and he mentioned the Dalai Lama. He's like, I don't know anything about him, but I know he's a man of peace. And I thought it was wonderful. And there are, as you peel off, that's enough. And as you peel off, there are layers that animate that and that inform that and that are the cause or the reason for that. So whatever anyone gets from the conversation is wonderful and rich. And, you know, we just let go what doesn't seem to be germane to us.
I just want to say thank you for bringing Thomas Merton into the conversation. I adore Thomas Merton for so many different reasons, and it was also Roshi, but also the Dalai Lama. He was friends with many Buddhists, and I think, and I look at certain sages such as Thomas Merton. When you really go deep, when you get to that point where you hit that point which is actually ineffable, it's like all these teachings, they're all words. Like there's a certain connection, and I saw that in Thomas Merton in his writings as well, that he could transcend kind of boundaries of religion and just get to the core of humanity itself.
Just to talk a little bit about Buddhism in the West, it's really in a state of flux. Most Asian, from what I understand, most Asian Buddhism was primarily monastic. And there were congregations, but they didn't generally meditate. They worked very hard to observe the precepts, but that was their primary method of practicing Buddhism. So Buddhism came to the West, and Americans mostly don't want to go into monasteries. They don't much like ritual. So Americans and Europeans are trying to adapt Buddhism to the West. And one of the problems is when we look at what comes in from Asia, we have to say, well, how much of this is the teaching and how much of this is sort of a cultural accretion from China or Japan or Thailand or Korea or whatever? What do we separate out as unnecessary? What do we keep as necessary? And let's be real careful not to get them mixed up.
I'm probably one of the few UUs here that grew up Buddhist. I grew up in California, born and raised, and so I grew up in the Shinshu tradition, and my mother was a Shingongshu tradition. But I wanted to focus, we don't have time, on the interlacing between Unitarianism and Buddhism, because I've seen both. Actually, at my age, I've now been a Unitarian longer than I've been a Buddhist, because I was a Buddhist until I was about 25 years old and had no longer access to a temple on the West Coast. So I want to just touch on a couple things. The point about the cultural traditions that came along, like in my case with the Shinshu, which was based on a monk in Japan that started that denomination. It does complicate things because of what baggage it brought with them. When I became a UU, I found that I didn't have to close the door on my Buddhist background, because the concepts of right and wrong, etc., the language was very similar. You know, instead of Buddhists saying, "I will not commit a crime," the Unitarians say, "We shall not commit a crime." Okay, so there's that parallel, and that interconnection made it very easy for me to become a UU. What I lost or left behind were the ritual practices of the Shinshu tradition, and I don't really miss that as a UU. Okay, but the concepts, the philosophy, the thinking, the value system, families, society, environment, all that meshed very well. And I don't know how many of you have studied Unitarianism, but let me just tell you that, you know, the intermeshing is incredible. More than that, when I went to the first General Assembly in 2004 in Los Angeles, Long Beach, California, I was walking out one morning from this annual meeting, and on the sidewalk by the hotel was signs on the sidewalk, gathering of Unitarian Buddhists. I didn't know such things existed. Blew my mind. I didn't join them. I mean, kind of watched with my jaws hanging on the floor, but there were a whole bunch. And subsequently, this is now, 15, 18 years, I've learned that there are, here at this congregation, you know, meditation groups, etc. On the other hand, there has been evolution. Meditation has become essentially secular, in the sense that there is a value to it, social value to it, psychological value to it, emotional value to it, that a number of people are beginning to develop practices, many of which begin in Buddhism, but which have evolved because of, again, as you point out, the cultural evolution here, certainly in the US and probably in Europe. I just want to close by saying that I got married in a Buddhist temple, Nu'uanu Mission in Honolulu. And the minister was named Reverend Hunt. Where did this dude come from? Well, he was an Englishman and became a Shinshu minister. And at the time he married us, he was like pushing 80, which I am now doing. And then I never met him subsequently for my 25th anniversary. But I was totally surprised to run across a non-Asian minister monk in an Asian congregation of Buddhism. Thank you.
I think that's the trend these days, is hybrid. I mean, they call them the Jubus, the Jewish Buddhists. Because if you look, the first, okay, there, totally, she's a Jew. The first lay teachers in America, I mean, they were Jewish, and they are Jewish. They're still alive right now, but we have that now, and I think that's beautiful. We have this hybrid going on, yeah.
And I'll say the Unitarian Universalists spell Buddhism with 2 U's.
That's cute.
Hi. I'm sure you have figured out by now that Unitarian Universalists are very big on social justice. And I'm wondering, what do the Buddhist traditions have to speak toward assertive change in society and working to create more justice? If everyone was a Buddhist, we might not need that, but everyone isn't. So what can we do with Buddhist sensibilities to do that better?
Yeah. Anyone want to pick that one up?
I'll take a shot. I've seen in Buddhism 2 different approaches. One approach is we're going to be very socially active. We're going to go out and we're going to, collect clothing for people and food, and we're going to go out and do this and do that for social change. My group has done a little of that, but not a lot. I think the other approach is, how can I make the world a better place? Okay, I start with me. I start with, when I go out to McDonald's, if I happen to go there, do I treat the person behind the counter with kindness and compassion? When I'm driving and somebody cuts me off, a future bodhisattva, how do I feel about that? Okay? So in other words, every interaction that I have with every person, and not only every person, if I'm out walking on a trail, do I see a piece of paper, do I pick it up or not? If I did everything I could every minute of every day to embody these principles, I think I'd be changing the world in a way that I think is important. But not everybody does it that way.
So in our tradition, actually the New Year's message from our Prime Dharma Master of One Buddhism this year was, renew myself to renew my community to renew the world. And I think that speaks to our view of how to make changes. And it kind of similar to what Walt was saying, it starts with me. And we have to be very careful of this, especially when we talk about using practice, meditation, and mindfulness, is because sometimes people use the practice as a crutch to ignore social issues. But I think what we're trying to do is saying social issues out there starts because there is a mind that is delusional, that is stuck in some kind of illusion and ignorance. So the whole point is knowing that the core of any social issue starts on the individual level, and that in some ways that can be my contribution to actually start working on myself first, and then slowly start seeing the world through eyes that are a little bit more wise. So definitely that the one issue right now that keeps coming up are people calling it McMindfulness, saying that mindfulness is now just a capitalistic tool. And so that's one thing that I am very cognizant about, is that definitely we have this practice to hone our wisdom and compassion, but definitely we should not ignore the social structures that prevent us from having true liberation.
I agree with what you've both said, and we'll offer the one maybe additive to the gasoline. I think this is really a tricky question for a lot of Sanghas and for a lot of Buddhists, and it really is for me. I know this week one of the things that I was doing was I was watching a lot of Dalai Lama videos, and one of them was he met with kids and the group was called Engaged Buddhists, and there is a movement now for engaged Buddhism, which is sort of social action. So I think there is more and more recognition somehow of moving outward in the world, and whether it's the environment or social justice, and sort of taking action. there's a definitely a tension, and you've both expressed it, and I experience it in my life, which is when I'm outward too far, I really lose touch with my sort of practice and sort of becoming the better person that I wish to become, or need to become, if I'm not engaging in my practice. And yet, when I'm just in, Walt, I think you were talking about the sort of the monastic tradition, when I'm only on my meditation mat and I'm not doing something, then I feel like I'm too insular in this world, and it's difficult. It's a balance. It's a balance that I think each person who practices has to find what the right balance is for them, where you're not going too far out and then become sort of part of the polarization, right? I mean, part of what we see happening right now, it's so easy in our political climate to become part of the polarization of our country, right? When the side gets louder, we have to get louder and more aggressive. And the communication, there's no sort of communication in the middle. And if you are the person who's trying to communicate in the middle, nobody hears you because you're quiet. And in the world of social media, it's louder and louder and louder also. And how do you frame that in your life as an engaged person who your spiritual practice is a practice of quietude in some ways, so you can see things, so you can recognize yourself and recognize others, and yet at the same time participate in the throng without just fueling it. And I don't think there's an answer, but it is definitely something that is real for us. Yeah.
Hi, I'm recently reading a book called The Second Mountain by David Brooks, in which it talks about, your first mountain is about, outer success in the world, and then the second mountain is really not so much about you, but about being in contact and connection with others in a meaningful way. And I'm a recovering therapist, so here's my question. I noticed that there's this, in this book it talks about egoistic self-obsession, where we're so concerned about what others think of us or even what we think of ourselves. And I also struggle with that. And I guess the line, I'm not sure who wrote it, but you have to be a somebody before you're a nobody. And I'm wondering, at what point do you stop trying to build self-esteem, and is that an illusion? And how does this all relate to Western psychology? And I have a kid who's 8 and a kid who's 10, and talk about self-obsession. Oh my gosh, So, at what point? Well, that's my question. I'm not sure I know what exactly the question is, but it's around that somebody versus you have to be a somebody before you're a nobody.
Mm-hmm. All right, since we went that way, we'll go this way now, this time. I don't really think that there's a single answer to that question. I think the point is when that's your inquiry and that becomes part of the path that you wish to be going down, that you're actually asking that question and you're interested in finding out what the answer is. It can't be, obviously, just like the three of us are, speaking here today, and I'm the esoteric guy. It depends on when you're in the space that information becomes useful to you. And if it's not useful to a person, then it's not helpful to kind of try to, as a therapist or as a friend, not necessarily helpful, not necessarily harmful, to offer it to them at that time. I think that, for me, that's a depends question. Maybe you have more illumination on that than I do.
Good question. We have to have enough of an ego to function, otherwise we'd hide in the basement and never come out. But we may see some people in public life who we think have a little too much ego. No names. Anyhow, I think the Zen approach is to the assumption is we are good, strong, kind, wise people. But all of that is covered up by the ideas we have about ourselves. I'm a good person, I'm a bad person. I'm a great person, I'm a loser. If I think I'm a great person, my ego's too strong. If I think I'm a loser, my ego's too weak. What we try and do in Zen is to point out, gee, that's just an idea. You are not a great person. You're not a terrible person. Look into your mind, and this is why meditation is absolutely necessary, and see what's in there that's telling you you're a great person or a loser, and let go. And the idea is, if we could let go of all of that junk, we'd be great.
I think this is why we need teachers. Teachers will tell you right away when you're going to the extreme. And that's basically, the teaching that I showed you before about that not either, that's when it helps. But sometimes I feel in certain cases when someone has that egotistical aspect, sometimes that we call it other power is important. So you need someone from outside to actually point that out, because sometimes we are ignorant of our own being, of who we truly are. So sometimes in that case you do need a guide.
Could I just add something to that? Because it's very critical to Zen. In Zen, one of the central themes is interview with the teacher. And it's very formal, and there's bowing involved. And the teacher will assign the student some practice. The important thing is if a student comes to interview and that student has a very weak ego, they're frightened, they're unsure, they don't know what to do, the teacher will be a grandmother, kind, gentle, sweet, encouraging. Now, the next person who comes to the interview is an egotist, I know everything, I know more than you do. Then the teacher becomes a tyrant and becomes an evil Zen master who cuts down the ego. Every student is treated according to their needs and their problems, and the teacher is always helping the student just let go.
Yeah, I would use my daughter as an example of that. You know, she's 21 and struggles with her self-esteem in relationships. And I mean, as her stepdaughter, as her stepdad, it's my job to just keep saying, you're beautiful and you're wonderful and you're great. All the negative things that she tells herself, like none of those things are true. You're a wonder of the world. This is not a relationship where I'm going to go like, you are none of those things, So it really depends on the person. It gave me a chance to talk about my daughter. Thanks.
Okay. The fourth principle of Unitarianism is a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. Okay, a free. That's word is very important there. Okay. And also the search for truth and meaning. This is the fourth principle. It stands alone. It's a big deal. What is Buddhism's approach to this principle? Does it accept it, or does it, or is it part, or you consider it part of Buddhism?
Everything that I know is don't accept anything. If the Buddha's teachings, don't accept anything just because I'm saying it. You have to go find for yourself whether or not this makes sense for you, whether it's true for you, period, end of story.
So you think of Buddhism as an individualistic search for truth and meaning?
I think there's offers of information, of
but you have teachers that help the search.
Teaching. Yeah.
Are teachers viewed as experts? I'm the expert, I have the truth, or is it helping the student discover the truth? That's a different.
Well, the theme of the service today was humility, and my suspicion is that the three of us would agree that if the teacher has real humility, then they're worthy of your interest in what they have to say. And if they're trying to superimpose something on top of you, then that maybe not be such a good fit.
So could a Buddhist...
So, Steve,
Okay,
I don't want to
sorry.
interrupt, but we have a couple more people who have questions, and we're over time, which I value you being willing to stay and answer more questions, but I do want to respect your time. So I'm going to take 2 more questions, and then any of you who are willing to stay and talk more to people who want to talk more, that would be wonderful. But if you need to get on with the rest of your day, that is also fine. So I think we have a question over here and a question over here.
Would you all talk about the repurposing of Buddhism by the psychoanalyst and psychiatry and that whole profession, using it to cleanse the emotional conflicts, like the mindfulness-based stress reduction programs? Just how is it being incorporated? Is it a good thing? Taking bits and pieces and trying to integrate them? Thank you.
So I think I understood your question correctly. So you're saying, is it okay to have Buddhism used in secular settings such as psychotherapy and psychology? There was debate actually in the MBSR. The whole history of that is it started in the 1970s and started by a doctor who also has a background in Buddhism, but he wanted to secularize it to suit the clinical setting. And so the contention was, well, it's taking all the core Buddhist teachings out. Is this ethical? And then so there's that argument. And the other argument says, well, if it's healing people, then let's just do it. So you're going to have different people on different sides saying you're stripping Buddhism of its core teachings. And then you have some people saying, well, if it's an intervention to fulfill what the Buddhist teaching was all about, which is to alleviate suffering and to create a better world, then let's do it.
Yeah, I'm with you.
Well, I'll quote one of my favorite Simpsons episodes. Now, it'll help if you're a Simpsons fan. Anyway, Bart Simpson is in his 6th grade classroom, and there's a woman is up front teaching something, and Principal Skinner is in the back watching. And Superintendent Chalmers comes in, and he asks, what is she teaching them? And Skinner says, she's teaching them coding. It's the new big thing. And Chalmers says, what? I thought mindfulness was the new big thing.
That's good.
Yeah. To me, there are 3 aspects of the teaching, which we sometimes call the Dharma. There's meditation, there's understanding, why do we suffer, and there are precepts. If you take the meditation away and you throw away the understanding and the precepts, I think you're headed for trouble, because the mindfulness can be used you can be a mindful person who does good and who's kind and gentle, and you can be a sniper who's very mindful. Okay, mindfulness is a tool that can be used in different ways. Without the precepts, the ethical part of Buddhism, and without the understanding, I think there are some real problems with just mindfulness.
I'm just going to add to that. Thank you, Walt. Especially from doing mindfulness in education, one of the things that we find extremely important is that educators, when they're teaching mindfulness to the children, the first thing we ask is, do you have your personal practice? So I think that's another element. If you're a psychologist, psychotherapist, do you have your own personal practice that has a certain, it doesn't have to be the exact same precepts, but their own ethical code that you have so that your practice has integrity.
Last.
All right, so I guess my question was about meditation. That's something that stands out to me as an integral part of Buddhism, and I was hoping maybe you could say a little bit about why that's so important to the tradition and so central to it.
I'll turn that to the Zen guy.
Well, in Zen, we do emphasize very much meditation. We call it Zazen. So, for example, where I go at the Soji Zen Center on Sunday, we have our main service, and we do 3 30-minute periods of Zazen. So Zazen would be a practice assigned by the teacher. Now, it might be for somebody who's new, counting your breath, or somebody who's a little more experienced, might be something called shikantaza, which is sort of unfocused awareness. Or we also have koans. Show me your original face, the face you had before your parents were born. All of meditation from our point of view is to get, first of all, to calm the mind down. We can't get out of the pattern of suffering because our minds are full of junk all the time. Let's see, what's for lunch today? Did I lock my car? Last week when I talked to her, she said some very nasty things to me. I wonder what I'm going to do next week. All of this stuff is constantly spinning in our heads. Now I can say to you, don't do that. You'll say, okay, and a minute later, you'll do it. The only way to quiet the mind is to do meditation because it calms, it quiets. And then we see the stuff that's deeper down. That's the real problem in our life. We never see it unless we do meditation.
Yeah, I'll second that because I've been going third too many times, taking all the space. And just to reflect what you're saying, Walt, one of the analogies, or 2 of the analogies that I've heard used by my teacher, the mind, it's like if you're in a cave and your mind is so busy, the light is spinning all over the place. Your flashlight is just waving all over the place because you're finding this thought and that thought and that thing, and you can't see the things as they are. It's not possible to do without stilling your mind in the practice. And almost you're actually kind of going to another level of your mind, another kind of mind. And then when the light is not sort of jostling around, everything in the cave becomes visible to you. Everything around you becomes visible to you because you're not creating all that disturbance with your normal everyday thought. Of course, we're not aware of that disturbance because we live in that disturbance. So we think that's the mind. But when you sit, you over time can recognize what I thought was the nature of myself or things around me looks very different from that quiet place where the light is not reflecting all over the place.
I think it's also important to realize, so when people say meditation, even if I say the word meditation, many of you may have just automatically picture someone sitting on a cushion in the seated posture. In fact, if you Google meditation, that's what you get. Those are the images that you get, are people in the seated posture. But I think what's important is that meditation is not just at rest, that there's a meditation in action that many of us may not know. And that practice, the reason why that's important is because, as I mentioned before, every moment we're making a choice. So, like they had mentioned, the point of meditation is to calm the mind. Because as you know, somebody says something to you that irks you, you have this emotion that arises. If you do not calm the mind and you react from that place, your thinking is polluted. If your thinking is polluted, then the choice you make most likely will lead you into an unwholesome direction. So the whole point, for example, when you're in action, the meditation would be at the moment that somebody says something to you that disturbs you, you pause. That's a meditation. You pause all thinking. Gives you space. And then when you calm down, it's almost like the waves of the water. If there's waves, nothing reflects clearly as it is. So the whole point of that moment of meditation is to calm the water so that everything can be seen clearly. And then from that place, you start to think. And this is the important part. People think, okay, well, it's just stopping the mind. It doesn't. If it stops there, nothing gets solved. You stop the mind, you calm the mind, then you think from a place of clarity. And in the One Buddhist tradition, we talk about rolling the thoughts. And what that means is when you come up to a certain situation, you look at it from different perspectives, from the big picture, from the individual details and from the perspective of change. So for example, here, if you were just to think from your perspective, you would only see this from this side. If I only see it from my perspective, it would just be on this side. Rolling the thoughts means looking at it from this side, looking at it from this side. Seeing the situation from that person's perspective, from my perspective, long term, short term, all of that. And then once you do that, then you make a choice, you make a decision. So there is that process of meditation being very practical for real life situations to make wise choices in life.
I want to thank you all again for being here, for staying so long. I think next time we should probably plan an hour and a half. And we like to show our appreciation by clapping. And I know we've had some kind of, are we going to clap? Are we not going to clap? Let's clap. And as I said, if you want to chat more, that's fine, but let's be done now. Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Oh, wow.
Thank you.